Chapter 2. When Natch had showed Roxy those tickets, she hadn't even glanced at where the seats were, but as he kept leading her closer and closer to the stage, her eyes got wider and wider. This close, Tag would be able to look right down and see them. She was sure of it. Or maybe all the lights the crew had brought in to surround the stage would blind him, and she'd be lost in a sea of blackness. She didn't know. She'd never been to one of Tag's concerts before, not even before that stupid night in Laramie, back when they were still talking. He'd asked her plenty of times to come and listen to him, to show her around backstage and meet the big names he was opening for at the time. After Laramie, she didn't go to his concerts. She didn't buy his songs. Nash didn't know the half of the lengths she'd gone to prove to Tag Turner that she didn't need him or his fame. "Wow, Nash!" She had to shout over the rumble of the crowd around them. The thousands of people packed into the fairgrounds had likely tripled the population of the county for the night. He turned to look at the stage, cranking his head back to see the crew rushing around with last-minute preparations. "Wow is right. I didn't even realize," he called back to her. He wrapped an arm around her shoulder, pulling her close in the crush of people. They waved at a group of guests at the ranch who passed them to get to still closer seats, and then stopped to talk to various people they knew from Little River, several of whom shook Nash's hand vigorously and congratulated him on the great seats and the backstage passes. "Make sure you say hi to Tag for us, Roxy," too many said. "Tell him how proud we are." She kept smiling and nodded that of course she would, if she saw him, if she hadn't yet figured out how to get out of going backstage with Nash. Nausea? She was already feeling a little sick to her stomach over having to listen to a dozen songs he'd always sworn she'd inspired. Had he moved on from that yet? Just a few months ago, when he'd released his latest hit, she'd accidentally heard some lyrics about walking hand in hand down the middle of the football field. Yeah, that was her. Her nerves eased up during the opening acts, a couple local bands chosen to represent Little River. She sang along with the crowd around her and grinned during one slower song when Nash pulled her into his arms to sway in the small space allotted them. She leaned against his shoulder and closed her eyes. She could do this. Just hold on to Nash and not think about how it would feel to hear those songs again. They were just songs, just words. It had been so long since she'd seen Tag. The way those songs had made her ache and made her heart pinch after he walked away had to have faded by now. The crowd hushed for a moment. Lights swung around them and the cheering started slow, then exploded into a boom when Tag strode onto the stage. 2 steps across and the music started. He clapped his hands with the crowd, slowing it to a beat that the people around her changed their frenzied clapping to match. "I kissed Tag's date at homecoming," a voice shouted from somewhere behind her. Colby Hunter, junior year. Roxy had told Tag not to take Macy, that she and Colby were going to get back together. On stage, Tag chuckled, along with the crowd around him. "I see you somehow managed to convince that girl to marry you." Roxy couldn't help smiling. She turned to where Tag was gazing out in the crowd, laughing along with everyone as Colby leaned over to kiss his wife. Whistles echoed around them, and Roxy couldn't deny the energy building, the pride in the people around her that this boy had been theirs. "It's good to be home, Little River," Tag shouted, drawing out the syllables of the town's name. The cheering exploded again, incoherent shouts joining the chorus, and Tag launched into his first song, his most popular. She knew enough to know that it had sat at number 1 for weeks and was still played constantly on the radio. She'd had to turn it off enough times to know. She'd never listened to all the lyrics before, but the words about home, trucks, farms, and family twisted at her heart. He sang in a nostalgic way, like he missed out on something. He had, but it had been his choice. 3 songs in, the tempo slowed. The band dropped off, and Tag moved center stage, just him and his guitar. It had been so long since she'd heard this particular song, it took a few measures to recognize it, and then she just hoped that it only sounded familiar. But no, the lyrics churned up in her even worse. She went still, in shock that he'd sing this song at a concert in Little River. This song had not been on any album he'd ever made in the last 8 years. "There's a place where everyone's at the game on Friday night, where you wave your hand at whoever's driving by, and it's all just right. There's a house where my mama raised 4 kids on God and faith, where the backyard was a stage and the kitchen table the place we learned to pray." "Rox," Nash leaned over and whispered in her ear. She didn't realize he had his arm around her, holding her close again, swaying softly with her. "What's wrong?" She turned to see him studying her, and she realized how much tension she held in her shoulders, how she clenched her hands so hard the nails bit into her palms. She softened her knees to sway along and shook her head. "Nothing," she said back. There's a girl, she mouthed along to the next words, still not believing that she stood in the middle of thousands of people listening him say this out loud, not sitting on the bed in her dorm room, tears choking her. Tag's voice broken as he sang his last plea to make her follow his dream with him. She's every broken piece of memory I never could let go, Tag sang. Could she be imagining that he looked right down at her, that their eyes met, that now, of all times, he'd pick back up that old habit of looking at only her, no matter how many people listened? And I wish that she could see she's still a part of me. Roxy covered her ears with her hands, but that couldn't stop the memory from falling down around her, along with the notes. I can't, Tag. She pushed the guitar away and stood from the bed, turning to look out the window at the scattered lights of Laramie. This is crazy. You're just... She didn't know what, but him showing up now and insisting he loved her all those years, it didn't make sense. He'd never said a word. You're just caught up in all of this and you want a piece of home. He came to stand behind her, spinning her around so that he circled her in his arms. I want you. I mean it, Rox. I have always wanted you. He bent his head over hers. The scruff of days on the road stung her skin when he pressed their lips together. He held her hips, pulling her closer, closer, closer. The sharp scent of his new cologne swirled around her. She ran her fingers on the back of his neck, and his arms shifted, wrapping around her back, pulling them into a cocoon of each other. She'd never imagined they could be this way together. Years of teasing, of silly flirting, hadn't prepared her for the way her heart leapt at his kiss. How am I supposed to believe you when you're throwing it at me all of a sudden, she murmured when they pulled apart. Confusion and fear had frozen the warmth in her chest from his nearness, from the passion he'd poured into his kiss. I've been saying it for years. You just wouldn't listen. I can't do it, she had said out loud. She couldn't trust him. He'd left the day after graduation, and she hadn't heard from him in the months between then and when he'd showed up at her dorm. And he'd expected her to walk away from her education, her plans to live near her family on the ranch, just because he'd shown up and said he loved her? He'd never said it before. How could a song count? How was she supposed to know that? Roxy? Nash's eyebrows slanted down with concern. Nothing. She forced a smile and leaned into him again, trying to ignore the words in Tag's voice. It's all in my head. These words aren't for me anymore. It's just a song. He'd said he'd always told her, and at first she'd looked for it in his songs, but he sang those same songs to every woman who came to every concert. I wrote that song for a very special someone who's in the audience tonight. Roxy's gaze snapped to the stage. He walked to the edge and looked down at her. I miss you like crazy, Roxy. His words held a lilt as he strummed on his guitar. Faces swung in her direction, some just following Tag's gaze and staring at the general area around her in confusion. Nash's hand squeezed her, and she glanced up at him. He grinned, but it was tied around his eyes as he stared at Tag. Too late, he shouted, making those around him laugh, making this all a silly joke that didn't mean anything. Please let Tag not pursue it. This was just like Laramie, a big, grand gesture in Tag Turner style. Roxy snaked her arm around Nash's waist, clinging to him. Nash was home. Then Tag swung his guitar around on his back and jumped off the stage. Cries of excitement echoed around him as he pushed his way toward her, hopping over the rows of seats. By the third one, the crowd had started to part. Cell phones were raised all around them, pictures snapping, recording video. Rox, Nash said, looking down at her. She shook her head in confusion. Tag pulled his guitar back around and started playing again as he came down the row toward her, fans eagerly backing out of his way to make sure this show played out exactly as romantically as Tag probably intended. This time, when he started to sing again, he started with her name. Roxy girl, I'll never be the same without you. I'm begging you to listen to me now. I need your love. The lyrics weren't smooth like any of Tag's other songs. They sounded cobbled together, but somehow more heartfelt than anything she'd ever heard him sing. Beside her, Nash tensed. She squeezed his hand back, begging him to stand by her in this onslaught. Anger heated inside her stomach that Tag would throw this at her so publicly, this encore coming years later than she'd expected. But her anger had to war with a piece of her heart that was caught up in him. This whole show has stolen a part of my soul. It's taken the pieces of me I meant for you to hold, and I need you to see you're everything to me. Roxy, please, please, don't turn me down. You're crazy, she whispered, shaking her head, but there was no way he heard her above the sound of the music still coming from his band on stage and his guitar now directly in front of her. He strummed a few more chords, staring directly at her before he stopped and reached for her hand. She backed away into Nash. Come home to me and sing along, Tag begged her. Please sing along. She shook her head, everything roaring inside her. She turned to Nash. I need to get out of here. Now. He gave a sharp nod and pushed through the row behind them, tugging her along with him. When they reached the aisle, she glanced back at Tag just before Nash put an arm protectively around her. Tag wore the same look he had just before he walked out of her dorm room in Laramie, like she'd taken his guitar and smashed it over his heart. Nash didn't talk as they drove from the fairgrounds. The music had started back up before they'd even finished their escape, echoing in the wind that swirled around them as the Jeep sped away. They pulled into the white rock of her driveway before either of them said anything. Nash swung the gear shift into park, but didn't turn to look at her yet. What was that? Laramie 2.0. Roxy leaned her head back against the headrest, staring out at the windshield at her house. She designed it herself, pored over every detail. An ache settled inside her at even the thought of leaving it. At the very thought of what Tag asking her to run away again, believing that all he had to do was sing and she'd fall into his open arms. Nash turned his head to study her. So, there's definitely more to your relationship with Tag than you let on, or what I guessed from what I knew and you let me assume. The space between his eyebrows pinched. She rubbed at her forehead. He showed up, claiming to have loved me all along, but you know how he was in high school. Always another girlfriend. She tilted her head to the side to look at Nash, worried about how big of a deal this would be for him, like how he would feel listening to the videos of Tag's song being shared and blowing up social media. Tag had done something big, and it wouldn't blow over soon. Her running away likely would only add fuel to the fire. And what else, Rox? Nash didn't reach for her hand or moved to put his arms around her the way he'd shielded her back at the concert, and that said a lot about how tonight must have made him feel. He just sang a song, clearly begging you to come back to him. Back to him? She gave a mirthless laugh. I'd have to be with him in the first place to go back. Rox. She sighed and closed her eyes. I told you about how he came to see me in Laramie, right after he got his first contract and blew up. And it was just that. Again, same old Tag. It's not real. He told her that night that he'd been hiding in a way all through high school and that he was going to show her he meant it when he told her he loved her all those times. He sang that song. Not that stuff he added on at the last, but the rest of it. It's the only other time I've heard it. Nash opened his door and got out, walking around the Jeep to open her door and pull her out into his arms. He stared down at her, brown eyes full of worry. It sliced through her heart that Tag's big, dumb gesture had done that to him. Why didn't you go with him? Roxy crinkled her nose. Why would I? All of a sudden, he was saying he loved me. It came out of the blue. Nash snorted with laughter, and Roxy scowled, leaning back her head to glare at her boyfriend. What? Everyone could tell he was in love with you back in high school, Roxy. Don't deny that. She pulled out of his arms and headed across the grass toward her porch, waving away his words. But he never told me. All that stuff he said in his songs, he's a musician. That's what they do. How was I supposed to know he meant any of it when he said it for real? Especially when he took off and didn't talk to me for 8 years in between. Silence settled between them for a long time, Roxy wondering what thoughts ran through Nash's head. And now, Nash finally looked up at her, but his expression was tight with whatever answers he'd come up with in the intervening moments. She shook her head and threw a hand back toward the fairgrounds. I never wanted that. Not when I was 18. Not now. I want home. I want Little River. She stepped back towards Nash. I want you. Tag had only been able to imagine bright lights and making it big, none of which he needed Roxy for. He could say the words, but Roxy didn't know what he really meant by them. She didn't reach out for Nash to force him into coming to her way of seeing what had happened tonight. She waited him out, since she didn't know herself how she really felt about Tag singing that song, and the things he'd said, and what it had meant that hurt had flooded through her from the first note until long after she ran away. How the words kept playing over in her mind, and how she couldn't stop thinking of the first time he'd sung it to her. When Nash still didn't say anything, she added quietly, He believes that all it takes is a song, and him asking for me to give up everything and walk away. But he doesn't understand real love. She folded her arms around her, determination growing. It joined the anger that had sparked earlier and the sting of how Tag had made Nash feel. What didn't Tag Turner understand about using a telephone? She glared out at the mountains where she knew Tag would head once the show was over, and it's about time I gave him the talking to he's deserved for 8 years.